So in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, was elected for the first time, or came into office for the first time, and now he's famed and lauded by liberals for the New Deal, but he wasn't actually initially elected on a New Deal program. So in the 1920s, he accepted the established the orthodoxy, economic orthodoxy. He opposed banking reform when he was governor of New York State, and in 1930, he opposed the previous President Hoover from the right, accusing him of being too interventionist for departing from laissez-faire capitalism. But of course, what changed him was the collapse of his old world in 1929 with the Wall Street crash. And if it took radical policies to save US capitalism, then he was prepared to do it. So he came in with a modest package of regulation and piecemeal programs, and many of which were actually watered down by the reactionary Southern segregationist wing of his own Democratic Party. But he was pressured to create more extensive social welfare programs by the threat of mass unrest and revolution. And it was a question of granting reforms and concessions from above, the alternative being to risk a potentially uncontrollable social explosion from below. So actually, it's under the New Deal, unemployment actually dropped from 15 to 9 million, but many of the new jobs were on minimal wages, and there was no social safety net, apart that there was for big business, of course. And federal expenditure also increased massively. So in 1929, it accounted for 3% of total wealth, but by 1939, it had tripled. So by 1937, production in the US was back to the level of 1929. So worker struggles had increased wages and therefore consumption, but then came a new sharp downturn with Black Tuesday in October 1937. And a crisis followed with a sharp fall in production and commodity prices. And production and profits continued to decline, and full employment only returned in 1941 with the US's entry into the Second World War. And this second economic disaster, I suppose, the latest in the end of the line of the increase in economic disaster, sort of forced Roosevelt and Congress to reinstate government spending programs. And in his pamphlet, Marxism in Our Time, one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky, commented. He said that the New Deal itself was possible only because of the tremendous wealth accumulated by past generations. Only a very rich nation could indulge itself in so extravagant a policy, but even such a nation cannot indefinitely go on living at the expense of past generations. And the New Deal couldn't overcome the basic laws of the capitalist economy, and the capitalist doesn't produce for the sake of production, as Trotsky says, but for profit. And the crisis in 37-38 proved that the New Deal was far from solving the problems for the capitalist class, and the underlying weaknesses in the system continued to trigger new crises, and still only an economy of the US's side had the resources to try intervention on the scale of the New Deal. And in most countries, the bourgeoisie handed over their state power to dictatorships and even fascism in order to prevent revolution and save their system. This, of course, was the case in Europe, where Mussolini's and Hitler's fascists rose to power in Italy and Germany. I think what's probably most important for anti-fascists and working people today is an understanding of why fascism, of what it is and why it arises. And without such an understanding, it's not possible to effectively combat and destroy it. And unless it's viewed from the angle of the prism of class structure of capitalist society and the class forces at work, we can't prepare ourselves for a future struggle against any rising fascist movement. So, and of course, no definitions of fascism in the media and popular consciousness vary greatly, and sometimes people use fascism as a description of conservative politicians they don't like, such as there's a trend in the early 2000s of calling George W. Bush a fascist, or in this country, Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson as fascists, but isn't a helpful label. So in Germany in the 1930s, there was a seriously powerful labour movement, two mass working class political parties, the Social Democrats and the communists, there have been revolutionary upheavals after the First World War with workers inspired by the Russian Revolution, but these tragically ended in failure. But in the Great Depression, fearing that this time the working class would succeed in ending capitalism, sections of the ruling class turned to Hitler's Nazis and began funding them. So they've been a very weak force throughout most of the 20s, but the failure of the socialists and communists to show a clear way out of the crisis led to desperate sections of the ruling middle class and unemployed workers to turn to them. And fascism in Germany became a rapidly growing mass movement based on the mass fury of worsening conditions and a redirecting of the blame for those problems onto minorities such as the Jews. And seeing them as the most reliable way to stop the threat of revolution, the number of big businessmen and other sections of the German ruling class giving funding and support to the Nazi Party started to increase dramatically. But even at that stage, if the communists and socialists, with millions of members and supporters, and even their own armed units, if they'd acted in a decisive action, they could have begun to push the fascists off the streets. But to really defeat the menace of fascism would have meant going on the offensive against the broken capitalist system, which breeds fascism, with a programme to end unemployment and poverty. And by contrast, in Britain, socialist trade unionists, Jewish workers acted decisively to check the embryonic fascist movement in the Battle of Cable Street on London's East End. And whilst it wasn't the only reason, but it was that strong approach really that helped to ensure the far right in Britain never grew into the truly mass movement like in Germany or Italy. But the historic failure of the left's leadership in Germany, and especially that of the Communist Party, to act decisively at this juncture opened the door to the Nazis taking power, even though they never won a majority of the votes. And as Trotsky was pointing out at the time, in opposition to the Stalinists, this is precisely the role that fascism has historically played. So once in office, the Nazis move rapidly to smash the unions and the left parties. And as Trotsky was saying, it's a mass social movement used by the ruling class when their system is under serious threat to smash the labour movement and organisations of the working class and to ensure the survival of capitalism. Actually, under the Nazis, the rate of surplus value increased by 300% in Germany. So in other words, the same amount of wages the bosses got 3 times the profit in 1938 compared with 1928. And it's actually unheard of in the history of capitalism. And at the same time, unemployment declined. And just imagine what might have happened in a free labour market with free trade unions in the same period. And that can only be explained by the total destruction of the labour movement by the fascists. Now, we're in the early stages of a deep global depression, and certainly the worst since the Great Depression, with the potential even to pass it. And just as during the 1930s, it's not going to be a linear process. There'll be contradictions and ups and downs as the capitalist crisis deepens. And political polarisation is already growing, with fewer and fewer people satisfied with the status quo. And this is particularly the case amongst young working class people who are gravitating towards left-wing socialist ideas. So in Britain, I think this is typified by the exam results protests over the summer and the current actions on university campuses. And this is only going to grow as the situation gets that much worse for the majority of working class people. And of course, coupled with this are the Black Lives Matter protests, further evidence of this bubbling anger at the inequalities and injustices of capitalism highlighted by the COVID crisis. I'm not going to have time really to go into the recent anti-vaxxer protests and anti-lockdown protests we've had in Britain, and what it'd be good if comrades come into the discussion as to what they think in the context of the rising far right, and of course in the US, where we saw during the Black Lives Matter protests, armed militia showing up at those protests and threatening those protests. I suppose, as alarming as these developments are, the right today is a long way removed from the 2 million strong and highly organised Nazi party, or even the the Ku Klux Klan in the USA, which had as many as 6 million members in 1924, or the British Union of Fascists, which had around 40,000 members in 1934. Historically, fascism has only come about with the blessing of a wide section of the ruling class, and only as a last resort. The threat of imminent socialist revolution doesn't exist today in the major capitalist countries, but this can change and will change in the coming years in the context of the deepening economic and social crisis of capitalism. The big majority of the ruling class believes that the situation is still salvageable through regular democratic norms, which have served them well so far. Ultimately, though, the interventions of the ruling class in the crisis-ridden economies of the 1930s, be that the New Deal in the USA or fascism in Europe, are all to save their system from total collapse. I've gone over time now, so I'll bring my remarks to a close, but I'll finish by saying over the coming period, we'll see a combination of concessions and attacks, stimulus and austerity from the capitalists. And this crisis will eventually create a mass understanding that this system is fundamentally wrong. You know, even from a low level of struggle and consciousness in many countries today, and the development of this class consciousness is not also won't take place in a straight line and can be potentially quite confusing and predictable. However, the working class today is far from defeated, just unorganised. And the 1930s shows that capitalism will survive at any cost if there is no conscious working class movement to abolish it. And the task in this new crisis is to build such parties, movements, and an international. I think that's what we're trying to do this weekend, and with this discussion today. And I hope that this introduction leads to a really interesting and fruitful discussion. I really look forward to hearing it at the start of what promises to be a really excellent weekend. So thanks, comrades. Cheers.